Dear Mr. Muniz, first of all, we would like to thank you for your time. It's a great pleasure to have you today here with Vocal Europe for this interview. So, we will start with a more general question because we are all well aware that COVID 19 left many countries in a complete surprise. And also, almost a year after, there are new threats coming from different directions, let's say, regarding this novel virus. In international relations today, also, we have new terms used like COVID diplomacy or even vaccine diplomacy. So, according to you, how is COVID 19 really shaping diplomacy nowadays? And also, did it affect Spain's foreign policy with its most important partners in the European Union, but also outside of it?
Sure. Well, thank you. Thank you for having me, and wonderful initial question. So COVID changed everything for the past year, and that's the truth. If you had asked me on January 2020 what the international agenda was going to look like, the issues that were going to occupy our time, I guess I would have missed a number of the most important issues. So when the pandemic started, and by the way, this is in itself something that should be the focus of our reflection, because the risk of global pandemics was always there. These are, I think they call them something like white rhinos. It's not a black swan. It's something that was known, that there was a probability of it happening. It was a very low probability but a very high incidence event when it happened. So when this started, for us in Spain, we conducted a number of foresight papers. So we asked the experts inside and outside the ministry to tell us what they thought would be the key issues that the pandemic would bring. And so I'm going to run through them very quickly because they ended up being very central to our foreign policy. So the first was that the pandemic could lead to a worsening of socioeconomic fractures within our countries, an increase in inequality, and hence also an increase in political fracture. So we had been seeing for the past 10 to 15 years this idea that rising inequality and the weakening of the middle class in many Western countries was leading to the weakening of the center of the political spectrum. So this idea that the rise of populism and of polarized politics was a consequence of socioeconomic fracture. Now, COVID could be a real accelerator of this. So we were very concerned that this would be the case almost right from the get-go. And we knew that COVID could do this because it would very probably affect precarious employment, and most markedly, it would affect single-parent homes more heavily. It was going to affect rural populations that were far away from public services more intensely. So we were concerned that this crisis would deepen this divide and hence worsen our politics in the medium term. So Spain has been very focused on, our diplomacy has been very focused, and I'll tell you in a minute how we did this, in making sure that both the management of the health crisis and the exit to the crisis was equitable and it was socially just. So, for example, just to give you an example, our vaccination campaign, which is ongoing at the moment, is universal, is free, and it's public, and it's accessible to everybody, right? So the idea is that nobody would feel. Our economic policy in the management of the crisis was very targeted at sustaining employment through furlough schemes and at providing liquidity and solvency measures for SMEs in the Spanish economy. So very different response to the 08-09 one. From a foreign policy perspective, we were extremely insistent in there having a very strong European response to the crisis. So, and this ended up crystallizing in the Next Generation funds from the EU. But also, and people tend to, I think, underplay this, but we were very supportive of the ECB's maintenance of its macro monetary policies that were very expansive. They were kept in place, not only kept in place, but expanded, which in turn allowed for us to put forward very ambitious fiscal plans like the ones I just mentioned. So the first thing was on the social impact. The second was on mobility. So again, in our foresight papers, we could see that this was a health crisis that would become a mobility crisis. And we knew this because we started looking at what was happening in Hong Kong and in Singapore and in Japan and in South Korea. And we could see that their borders were becoming much less porous. They were implementing these very tough measures at the border. So we knew already almost from March, April, that this health crisis would become a crisis of the mobility and the proximity economy. And this is not very good news for countries like Spain that are transportation and tourism hubs. I mean, we receive upwards of 80 million tourists in 2019, right? So we have this huge and highly competitive, in fact, tourism sector. So we've been trying to manage the consequences of this by trying to build a consensus in Europe on measures and a protocol for mobility that is homogeneous and coherent across countries, but also at the OECD and others. So suddenly mobility, I mean, again, if you had asked me in January, will you be working, tirelessly to try to protect freedom of movement within the Schengen space? I mean, I would have probably said no. This is one of the most consolidated rights that we have in Europe, but in fact, this is one of the ones that was truly affected by the crisis. And one final point, although there were other indications in these papers, but I would say another key element was this idea of strategic autonomy for Europe. So we could see, because we were having already trouble in March and April with supplying very fundamental products that we needed, products and medicines that we needed to tackle the crisis. We were facing shortages and a real crisis in some of our supply chains for generics, for protective equipment, for respirators, all of these things. So we could foresee that would unleash a debate about how we build much more resilience into our supply chains and how we prepare Europe and European countries and ourselves to deal with future shocks like this one. And lo and behold, we're in the middle of this debate now in Europe about how we build resilience into European supply chains and others. So this idea that strategic autonomy would increase its intellectual footprint, its footprint from the foreign policy and security field, which is where it's always been, to include also the issue of trade, of supply, also of the digital market, so that we can have a truly European effective digital market. Because if you think about this, and this is, I think it's an interesting point, one of the responses to this crisis has been to move a lot of our activity from the analog to the digital. But a lot of the most competitive digital providers, including, by the way, the one that convenes us today, which is Zoom, which is an American company, these are not European providers, right? But this is true about cloud, it's true about 5G, it's true about geolocation services. So we could see that this crisis would elevate the tone and the urgency of the debate about autonomy. So those are just three examples of how much the crisis has changed the global agenda and how diplomacy is conducted.
Great, thank you very much for this answer on this very important question today. And now we are going to move towards the more domestic sphere, because we saw that a month ago, Spain's government introduced a new plan, new strategy, guidelines for its external relations. And also, it is very interesting to see that for Spain, topics that are going to be in focus are, for example, humanitarian policy, diplomacy, or also more feminist foreign policy. So we would like to hear more from you. Why did Spain decide exactly in this moment to make some changes in its external policy? And also, can you tell us more in general about this foreign action strategy that is introduced by Spain's government?
Sure, very, very happy to do that. And the reason why we've done this is because we had an outdated foreign policy strategy. The last one was passed in 2015, and as you can imagine, we live in a very different world, not just because of COVID, but even more so because of COVID. So we had to update our strategic documents. This is the peak document in our strategic pyramid. So it's basically our top foreign policy strategy. It should cover a 4-year period. And what this document does, and the reason why there's so much emphasis on human rights and on the rights of minorities and on feminism and on respect for diversity and democracy, is the following. So the document begins with a diagnosis of where the world is headed. What's the backdrop to our strategic reflection, which, by the way, I think it's a very healthy way of beginning a process of strategic outlining, right? You need to understand what the backdrop is. And in our mind, the backdrop is this drift for the last 10 to 15 years away from a liberal international order into a much more nationalist, closed, and unilateralist order. You can see this in the weakening of certain key multilateral institutions like the WTO, in the moving backwards from regional integration processes, with Brexit being perhaps the clearest example. But you can see it also very particularly domestically. I mean, this idea of a regression or a moving backwards in freedoms and liberties and in the resilience of democracy as a form of government in some places. I mean, maybe the most evident example of this is the events that we saw in Washington, D.C. on the 6th of December, this idea of institutional weakening in the democratic world. So if in the 1990s, we were all reading, Fukuyama and the others, and they were saying this is the end of history, liberal democracy and open markets will roll over, they'll occupy the totality of the world. Suddenly we find that in fact history is back, and we have these illiberal actors in the world, and we have in fact liberal democracies being weakened at home. If you add to that my answer to the previous question, which is COVID could be a real accelerator of this process by deepening social divides within the Western world, which lead to institutional questioning within the Western world and a democratic weakening, right, within democracies themselves, then you have this mix which constructs a backdrop that needs to inspire how we think about our foreign policy. And then Spain's external action, foreign policy strategy, what it says is, well, this trend is bad for Spain. I mean, we, as an open, highly integrated in the global economy, progressive democratic country, we would much rather see a world that is heavily multilateral, that is integrated economically, but has a just and fair global economy, that is sustainable on the environmental side of things, that is democratic, where minorities are respected. I mean, we would much rather see a world like that, right? We think that our interests and our values are better protected in a world like that. And then what the document does is it structures our foreign policy into four axes of action. One is the promotion of democracy, human rights, and feminism, and the rights of minorities. The second is a new social contract globally, which is a fair global economy, basically. We would like to see a fair taxation for digital companies, and we would like to see an effective competition policy. We don't want to undo the international, global economy. We want to make it fair. And then the third would be a green world. And the fourth is reinforced regional integration processes, with Europe being the main one for us, European integration, and multilateral system. And then it is within those four axes that Spain structures the totality of its foreign policy. So that's basically the main thrust of the document. And we think that it's a brave and an opportune document because of what we're living. So I hope you guys, you get to read it, and the people following this do. But that's the reason behind the emphasis on the things that you cited.
Well, Mr. Muniz, thank you so much for your answer. Now, going back to the global order, as you know, the past years have witnessed a certain rift within the Transatlantic Alliance due to Trump's unwillingness to work with European Union. As such, it is clear that China and Russia have profited from the situation, posing various threats not only to member states of the European Union, but also pursuing an aggressive foreign policy against the unity of the Union. Now, looking at recent comments that were made by the EU and US official during the Munich Security Conference, I would like to ask, what do you think are the major challenges but also benefits of the EU-US cooperation and the Biden administration to tackle these two major geopolitical contenders that are Russia and China?
Thank you. So let me say something first, which is I'm of the opinion that there is an Atlantic civilization that we share with our colleagues from the other side of the Atlantic, very fundamental values and norms that have inspired our political systems. And some of these are a respect for individual freedoms and rights, a respect for democracy, and they're very valuable pieces within this. The freedom of speech, the freedom of association, and I think that that's extremely important, right? And so my answer is going to be built on the notion that the Transatlantic Alliance is the bedrock of the international liberal order that I just mentioned before, as fundamental to the interests and the values of my country. So let me add that from the get-go. Now, on the Biden administration in particular, one has to ask. I mean, it's a very valid question. Is it good for Europe or bad for Europe, or is it better that we have a Biden administration compared to the prior one? We're quite optimistic about what we can do with the Biden administration. If you buy the diagnosis that I laid out before, that one of the main threats to us has been this erosion of the multilateral architecture, then a much more multilateralist American administration must surely be good news, right? And some of the signs coming out of Washington point in that direction. So the U.S. has rejoined the Paris Climate Accord. It has rejoined the WHO. Just today, we heard signs that they're willing to re-enter negotiations, at the OECD on the taxation of digital companies. They have expressed a willingness to rejoin the JCPOA, the nuclear deal with Iran, with some tweaks to the agreement, but it's a very different language to the prior administration. He has restated the US's commitment to Article 5 of NATO. I mean, the list goes on and on. And these are not minor issues, right? Now, when it comes to China and Russia, that also means that we're going to close all of these smaller, peripheral issues that we had open with the US, and we could maybe focus on the ones that are much more fundamental, which are in fact these collisions of interests with other actors in the world like Russia and China. And in fact, we have our take on this is that we need Russia and China on a whole range of issues that are global and on which we in fact have very shared interests, like for example, the fight against climate change, the regulation of global financial markets, issues linked to migrations and to economic development in different places, some things linked to the global management of health, for example. But there are other issues where we collide, and we need to accept that this is the case on very particular things. We collide on human rights and political models, and we need to be very explicit about this with our Chinese and Russian colleagues, and we should do this together with our American friends with whom we share that broad catalog of values that I mentioned. So I think that we're going to have a very broad agenda of shared issues and interests with the Biden administration, but the start looks quite promising from our end, and we think that there's a window for us to collaborate very closely with them on very important issues for us.
Oh, thank you so much, Mr. Muniz, for this answer. Now, coming back to European Union, as you may know, back in October, the European Commission published an enlargement package. In essence, this package is aiming at reviving the enlargement process with promises on substantial economic assistance in exchange of reform in the Western Balkans. Also, the Commission has outlined that the enlargement process will be in the spotlight during this mandate. In this respect, could you tell us more about Spain's position regarding the future enlargement of the European Union towards the Western Balkans and Turkey?
Yeah. So Spain has been highly supportive of enlargement over the years, and we remain supportive of enlargement. We think it's it's in fact the main convergence tool that we have, although I'm not sure it's ever understood in those terms, but the truth is that it's a huge convergence tool. It helps countries converge economically with the most advanced economies in the world. It brings stability. It increases the capacity of Europe to influence events around the world. And as one of the main beneficiaries of enlargement, Spain can only, I think, coherently see it with very positive eyes. So, Spain has been in favor of enlargement to the Western Balkans for a long time. The fact that we have such a high opinion of EU membership and the effects of enlargement also mean that we want to be rigorous in the process of assessment of the enlargement process. So we would want all of these countries to go through the formal assessment with rigor and not cutting any corners or accelerating the process unduly. But we're in favor of this. And we have, in fact, been supportive of continuing negotiations with Turkey and opening and closing chapters of accession with Turkey, as swiftly as we can and as circumstances demand. So, that has been Spain's position. We would much rather see, Turkey within the EU that far from the EU. And that has been that has been our stance. We understand again, but I don't want to belittle the difficulties of enlargement and how how strict we need to be on the conditions, because EU membership is a is a high bar. I mean, it sets a high bar in terms of governance, in terms of normative convergence with the EU. But overall, we think that it's been a very positive process for those of us that have benefited from it and are now members of this wonderful union.
Thank you, Mr. Muniz, for those insightful remarks on the Western Balkans. Now, I would like to recall the recent bilateral talk between Spain and Morocco that were held a few days ago. Those bilateral talks were focused on regional issues such as in the Maghreb, the Sahel, and the Euro-Mediterranean area. Knowing that Spain has been a driving force within this partnership and has shown a great interest towards the MENA region, could you tell us more about Spain's position regarding the Euro-Mediterranean partnership and also in regard to EU security interests towards the MENA region, such as with the ongoing Libyan crisis? Thank you.
Yeah, the so Spain's partnership with Morocco is a very important one. It's one of the strongest bilateral relationships that we have, and it covers a whole range of issues, from an economic partnership to a development partnership to issues linked to the control of migration flows, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it's a long list of issues that we share with the Moroccans. So it's an intense dialogue that we have with them. When it comes to the region, for us, both the Euro-Mediterranean dialogue, but also the 5+5 dialogue, plus the Sahel, I think are particularly key issues for us. On the Sahel in particular, we've been very focused. Spain is now chairing the Assembly of the Sahel Alliance, and there's a reason why we're doing that, and we've committed to the region. I think the Spanish foreign minister has now visited the Sahel, I think, more than any of her predecessors. She's been to all of the countries in the Sahel, in fact, already, and to some of them more than once. And she's been in office for a little bit over a year, so that just gives you a sense of the intensity. But we think that a lot of the issues that will affect Europe's security are being dealt with in the Sahel. I mean, these are things that have to do with the fight against extremism and terrorism, with building state capacity in many of these places, with preventing criminal organizations managing the traffic, the flows of people into Europe, which is something of great concern for everybody in Europe, because once they've set foot on European ground, they're in Schengen, right, and they're in the EU space. Even though most of them are now, in fact, arriving through Spanish territory because they're going into the Canary Islands in large numbers. So we're very focused in this region for a whole range of reasons, right? On the economics, let me add something positive, because I wouldn't want to just limit my answer to the security and migration issue, illegal migration issue, but also the economics. So my prior answer to the shortening of the supply chains, to this idea that that strategic autonomy would mean that we would bring some of the production of these key issues back to Europe or to its vicinity. A lot of that we think will end up in the southern neighborhood of the EU, or the southern rim of the Mediterranean, and a lot of it might be, in fact, in Morocco. We have a lot of experience in Spain with having highly integrated supply chains with Morocco. It's actually, in fact, almost equivalent to the integration, maybe not so intense, but it might be in the near future, to the integration that we see between Mexico and the US. So these are very strategic partners for us when it comes to economics as well. By the way, let me also mention supply of energy, because most of the natural gas that we're using in Southern Europe is, in fact, coming from Northern Africa. From Algeria, some of it from Tunisia and others, but it's definitely coming through that part of the world right into Europe. So highly strategic, and we have a huge interest in this part of the world doing well.